So, Renato, in the last week, we saw the horrific beating of Tyre Nichols by Memphis police officers. This was completely caught on video. Does that mean that this is going to be an easy case to prosecute?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a tweet. So, Asha, I don't know if we've ever seen a beating or police brutality that was this disturbing and was caught on video from so many angles, like this one was. I mean, it was very difficult to watch.
Yeah, and Renato, full disclosure, I've read a lot about the case, including in the aftermath of the video being released and people's descriptions of it, but I could not bring myself to watch the video, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I've watched a lot of it. I don't know if I've watched everything. I watched body cam, and then there's a surveillance footage from across the
telephone
street.
pole. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that really is what is most revealing. One thing that I think is interesting is one thing I tried to do was imagine that there's only the body cam footage. And if there was only the body cam footage, I actually think this would have been a much more difficult case to prosecute, because you can make a lot of arguments about what they can see and what they can't see at different points in time. Your vision's obscured. I actually think it's the surveillance footage from across the street that is much more telling about the scene. But even so, I would not be surprised if there's a very vigorous defense from some of these officers.
And what would the defense be? So, in a shooting case, which is sort of this nanosecond type of response, right? And the law gives a lot of latitude to the subjective perceptions of the police officer if they have a reasonable belief that, their life is in danger, or this other person is about to use deadly force, and then the gun is fired. This was an ongoing beating.
Right.
And it was 5 officers on one. I think there were even more
Correct.
at the scene. So what would be the defense in this case? It's not in law enforcement, they say action beats reaction, right? Which is why
Right.
that your brain processing what it's seeing versus the response of firing the gun happens so quickly that there's a time delay, or a kind of a time constriction. This seems to be fundamentally different than that type of situation.
I agree with that. I mean, it's certainly when there are shooting cases, like you said. I mean, the argument is that you are reacting to something and you don't know what the danger is. You thought you saw a gun and you did what you did. I think this is definitely a much more challenging case for the defense. I think one complicator that I'm going to put off to the side is, as you mentioned, there's so many people involved, and the piece of it that I'll put to the side is one of them could flip, or more of them could flip. In other words, I think a very viable strategy for prosecutors is basically try to pick off one or two of the officers, give them a good deal in order to flip on the rest, and then that makes the rest of your case much easier. I do think if one of the officers testifies for the government and is like, "Yep, we all knew that were going to murder somebody, we decided to murder this guy," that's just very difficult for the rest to overcome. So that would make it not as complicated, because I think the jury is going to credit the testimony of one of the officers in that circumstance, particularly because an officer is not like the typical flipper. Like the typical flipper that I would put on the stand is like some sort of, you know, just hoodlum criminal, whatever, like I'm drug cartel kingpin who's trying to flip down on my couriers or whatever. This is like a police officer, but obviously someone in the same position. I think, but I think otherwise, I mean, one thing I'll just say as a starting point that I don't know if our listeners will like to hear, but I think is a reality is that police officers start with this huge amount of credibility with the jury. And it really exists. And, I will say this as somebody who's been a prosecutor who used to investigate police officers, and has also been on the defense side up against law enforcement. I mean, it is very hard to go up against law enforcement because the jury, I think, presumes that they're right. And so I think the angles that I would be looking at on the defense side would be one of a few things. I mean, one thing they could do is plead to some lesser count and say, "Look, I did X, but I'm not a murderer." Okay, that's, I think, very viable for these officers. They can say you didn't see, what the it's going to likely be built around what you couldn't see. Like, hey, you didn't see this thing that happened beforehand or afterward, or this angle. You couldn't see what he was doing. Um, and maybe we overreacted in this way, but we were reacting to XYZ that he did. Um, but I certainly think, the focus is going to be on the more serious charge, right? Murder versus I think you may need to concede. You may have, you may ultimately have a defense strategy that's going to draw some concessions on that. They're going to make some concessions on some of the easier to prove charges.
Yeah, and to clarify, when you say like the defense will be able to capitalize on the fact that there were so many people, do you mean that because they can coordinate their story unless someone can flip? Is that what you're saying?
That's right. They'll have a coordinated, if they're all on the same side and they're all telling a consistent story, then I do think that's helpful for the defense. The hard part with the defense when there's multiple defendants is usually the government can pit them against one another.
Yeah.
And there's an incentive to point the finger like, hey, I was just following the lead of that guy, who, he's the real bad guy because you want the jury's going to want to blame somebody. But if they can all stick together, which happens a lot of times, police officers, there's definitely, I think, a code of conformity there where they all stay on the same side. I think the defense is harder than you might think. I'm not saying that this isn't a righteous prosecution. I'm not saying that what the officers did was right. I'm just explaining to you why it's difficult to get convictions against police officers, because I think a lot of folks in the public are like, why aren't these people convicted? Or why do they present cases to grand juries and they don't return indictments? I'm trying to explain that a little bit.
Yeah. Do you think that the inherent credibility of law enforcement has eroded in the last several years, especially since George Floyd? That's part A of my question. And B, that the existence of video means that one does not have to rely entirely on the account provided by the law enforcement officer, but are able to draw conclusions based on what they see with their own eyes. And I think the George Floyd case was an example of this, right? Like, I mean, it was hard to deny exactly what was happening, as these officers, knelt on him as he was crying for help. So I'm wondering, whether that part of the challenge may be less now than perhaps, even 5 years ago.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the video is the main change there. I was a prosecutor back when there was a lot of discussion about whether there should be body cams, and the amount of resistance in law enforcement, that included in the FBI. I mean, the amount of resistance was unbelievable. I mean, we had a discussion, internally in federal law enforcement about recording interviews too. It was a similar thing, like, should we record interviews or not? And there's a lot of resistance to that. And I think there's no question that the recording, that using body cams is a tremendous tool that is being used to hold law enforcement accountable. I mean, I think let's just be real here. If there is no video, I mean, I was saying what it would be like if we didn't have the surveillance footage from across the street, but without body cams or surveillance footage, if this was just his say so, he's not even
They
around to
may not
say
have ever
anything.
even uncovered that these people may not have ever been arrested.
Yeah, these officers would have some story like this guy was violent or he pulled a gun. Who knows what they would have said? And people would have chalked it up to it's impossible to prove. I mean, part of the difficult thing with police officers, of course, is that force can be used in certain circumstances, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think without video, this would have never happened. When you mentioned the influence on juries, I mean, I think despite video, I think the influence on juries is dependent on area. I mean, I think, um, if you told and I don't know what the jury pool is going to look like here, but let's say, if you told me I'm going to have a very urban jury pool, that would be different than a jury pool that's very, whether it's rural or suburban, because I think that there are still a lot of folks who will deify and the police and give them a lot of
Yeah.
deference. That's just the
Yeah.
reality.
I do think that public perception, I mean, I'm always struck by this, that this has been going on for decade. I mean, this is really a part of the lived experience of many Black Americans in this country, has been for, many for a long time. And I think, it's been in the shadows, and the advent of video and social media. I mean, we talk about all the downsides of social media, disinformation, all this, but I think one of the ways in which it has been a very powerful tool to shed light on things that were previously simply many people I think weren't aware of, and especially in terms of its pervasiveness, um, which, I think will help in building momentum for some significant changes in how law enforcement operates.
Yeah, I do think that that's more difficult than folks often give credit for. So, there is some. I know there's some debate over very minor reforms, federal reforms that are bipartisan. I think Cory Booker and Tim Scott have a bill that they've worked on together that are very, I would say, very relatively minor. I think one of the issues that makes this difficult, and I'd be interested in your thought on this, is that you're dealing with like local police forces all
Mhm.
across the country. There's not like it's like dealing with local school districts, right? Like every police force has got its own training, they have their own policies, they have their own procedures. I mean, one of the things that made this a lot better for the prosecution is the police chief was like, "Yeah, nope, I'm not defending this at all. We're immediately getting out in front and taking swift action," because a lot of times it's hard. And I know in our circumstance, one of the things in Chicago that made it very difficult to investigate police officers is there was collectively bargained contract. And part of that, the police union's deal was that a police union representative would speak to the police officer before law enforcement. And it's like a special treatment. Like, can you believe, like, if somebody is, let's say, committed a apparent killing, and it's like, well, no, law enforcement's not allowed to interview that person. We have to let them speak to their own authorized representative. But that's, that sort of thing is not uniform, but it's a problem on a local level.
And I think many local police departments also have their own internal oversight or investigation, who are, I think, often shunned by the rest of the department because they're seen internally as being,
Yeah.
as sort of betraying this culture, which I think is why it's really important that there's also the potential for a federal investigation and prosecution. It looks like, as you said, in this case, the local police chief is completely on board with moving forward. But I imagine that where there is resistance within the local police department, that vindicating the civil rights of the victim becomes paramount. And the fact that there's this additional layer of oversight is really important.
Yeah, I agree. Although I will say, people are often looking for the feds to come in. I mean, Section 1983 is usually the vehicle to do so. And it requires a pretty substantial burden of proof for the government. And so I just think that the feds are not always able to prosecute most cases. And what they're prosecuting is not like murder. That's a state crime. That's not a federal crime. They're prosecuting like a violation of the civil rights
Right.
of the victim. And while that's powerful and that is something that the federal government should be involved in, I mean, if you really wanted to do something, aggressive about this problem, you would create new federal crimes that
Mhm.
were more straightforward to prove and that fit this and move more of those prosecutions federally. I do think the federal government is more capable of handling these prosecutions than the state, in part because state prosecutors have a relationship with the
Yeah.
police department. Right? Just like when you're a federal prosecutor, you have a relationship with the FBI or DEA or whatever. Like it's harder for the state prosecutors to go hard at police officers.
Yeah. So even before that stage, I think there's a few, you know, problems also with this whole dispersed decentralized system, which is, I think there's a screening problem to begin with. Um, these types of jobs attract people who are not suited to be in these positions. And I think, to not be able to adequately, I had a question on Twitter that was like, what is it about training that turns people into this? And I think there is
Mm.
definitely aspects of the police culture that can take weaker, morally weak people and allow them to become complicit, like we saw in the George Floyd case where they just stand by. But I think for the people who truly are the perpetrators of this, I really believe they're like this when they come in. And that they are kind of predisposed to engaging in this type of behavior, um, which frankly to me seems sociopathic. Um, but I do think there's also a training issue. I mean, in many of these cases, um, I am just question like what is exactly going on. I mean, in this particular case, for example, the pretext was that this was a reckless driving stop, and why do you need 5 police officers to do a reckless driving stop? This seems very odd to me. Um, and, and then there's there's also that culture, that, cone of silence where there is the implicit threat of being ostracized or punished. I mean, in many ways, it's, kind of a mini authoritarian culture, right? Where, you know, there is a high cost to speaking up or speaking out or not conforming with what you're being told to do, and that piece has to change. In other words, to create mechanisms for whistleblowers to be protected and to actually be valued in that police culture.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, look, I think it's really you're asking some very like fundamental questions. I think, a couple thoughts I have. I mean, first of all, we obviously have to screen police very carefully because it's a job where the use of force is authorized against other people, and any
Right.
job where you have the power to control people's lives, to use force against them, to potentially kill them, is very serious matter. I think that, I don't believe though that it's always, how you come in that can create issues. I do think the experience that police officers have can be very challenging and very can create a lot of, challenge mental health challenges even for police officers. I
Yeah.
mean, I used to work alongside police officers when we would take state cases, and some of what they went through, so I was a prosecutor in Chicago, and in the South and West Side, I used to we used to take certain cases, gun cases, that from the state, and I was blown away by it was essentially like listen. I would listen to the audio of their internal comms, their internal radio calls from these evenings, and it was like a war zone. Like they were basically like,
Mhm.
"There's a shooting here. Oh my God, there's something going on there." It's like constantly like shootings all over the place, and they're running around, and they're just like constantly and afraid for their lives. And it just, I do think over a period of time that can be a very traumatic experience. And it may be that, when you're in that world, that sometimes just like there are soldiers who will dehumanize their opponent, I think that maybe some of these officers end up dehumanizing the people that they interact with, who of course are not your combatants in a war. These are human beings and they're United States citizens, but they are viewing them as sort of not human, just to kind of cope with what they're going through and what they're experiencing, which is hard.
Yeah, and that may be true, but I think then that points to the need for more like consistent mental health evaluations of people who are in the type of jobs where they are on the front lines of the violent crime, that you're talking about. I mean, I know in the FBI, for example, when agents go deep undercover into violent crime, gangs, white supremacist groups, these types of things that are probably incredibly disturbing and can have major psychological impacts, they're required to undergo periodic psychological evaluations to ensure that they're basically not, sort of blurring the line
Right.
between, this role they're playing and who they really are.
Mhm.
Um, so that's a good point to bring up, and I don't know that I've heard that part of it really discussed a lot.
Yeah, I think when we think about solutions, we pivot from like, okay, this is really awful. I mean, no one can justify a brutal murder of someone like this. But when we move from that to like, how do we solve it? I do think at the ideally, I mean, politically, it may not be possible, but ideally, this would happen at the federal level, and certainly new crimes are part of it. But prosecuting your way out of problems is generally it's not a real
Yeah.
solution.
It's too late.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not addressing the root
Exactly,
problem.
like, people are already dead, right? So, I think and people who are gonna brutally murder someone like this, they're not necessarily gonna always be thinking rationally about, like, what are the potential consequences, yada, yada. I think you wanna be thinking, like you said, mental health, support, but also policies, procedures, training, things that will change cultures, which I don't think you can do, like, department by department. Like you really, I think there needs to, I think there's a lot of work that can be done at the state level to create standards.
Mhm.
Police officers, there could be lots of licensing and accreditation and training requirements for police officers. More than there is now for that focuses on the use of force and the appropriate use of force. But also there could be work done at the federal level as well.
And I also think it's important to change who goes into these jobs. I mean, there's a self-selection problem, I
Mhm.
think, right? These are law enforcement is overwhelmingly male. I think it's generally overwhelmingly white. And part of that is that is the pipeline of people who go into those jobs. And I think one danger, I think of creating sort of an adversarial mindset with regard to citizens and law enforcement is that you have people who could never imagine becoming a part of that, but in some ways you do need that. Like, you need more women, you need more people of color, you need more um I think people who come from those communities to be in those positions to, I think, truly affect change from the inside as well as externally.
Yeah, indeed. I think that can only help, although obviously, as we saw in this case, not a perfect solution. All right. So, Asha, I will give a peek behind the curtain here and say that one topic that I really wanted, this is something that I really wanted to talk to you about because I found so fascinating and I wanted to get your insight on this, was seeing the reaction to the Paul Pelosi video and 911 call. Because it's very hard to listen to that 911 call and not have the very distinct conclusion that this man was scared for his life and was trying to keep a very hostile person calm. And there's also obviously a very brutal attack on the video. And one thing I found absolutely fascinating, Asha, was to watch. Obviously, there are some people on the right who are just doubling down on their narrative just because truth didn't matter to them. But there are actually some people on the right who I don't generally have a lot of respect for. People like Candace Owens, and Mike Cernovich. I mean, these are like literally people who peddle in conspiracy theories, but who are like, oh, actually, when I read that, listen to that 911 call, this guy was legitimately afraid for his life. And it was so fascinating to see when they would tweet that out, their followers were like, they didn't believe them. They were like, they were all in on the lie, even when people that they would usually trust and usually follow were saying the exact opposite. And I'm curious, as somebody who looks a lot at disinformation, how you react to seeing this all unfold.
Yeah. So there's a few things. And just to be clear, the narrative as I understand it, I mean, I really wasn't in the dark corners of right-wing media when the Paul Pelosi thing happened, but I think there was some implication that he was involved in a relationship with the assailant, and that this was sort of an altercation that came out of a lover's spat of some kind. Is that essentially what this was, the story was?
That's right. They point to the fact that, like, well, he was in his underwear. Well, of course, he was like in his out of bed, like he was awakened out of bed in his home. So that's not like entirely surprising. They'll say he had a drink in his hand, like and they'll point to his DUI, and they're basically insinuating, like you said, a relationship gone bad with the assailant.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things going on. So the first is sort of that Mark Twain quote that a lie will get halfway around the world before the truth can put its boots on. And I think that this is a perfect example of that it only takes um a few people, and frankly a few influential people, to put this narrative out there, and it will travel like wildfire. And I will say Elon Musk was one of those people. And I think I remember seeing some analysis of how quickly this narrative traveled, and there is a spike after Elon Musk said, I
Hmm.
think there's more to the story, or something like that.
Right.
And which I don't think he is one of the people who's ever retracted his position. And so the other thing is that once people believe something false, it is incredibly difficult to get them to back down, because there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that gets triggered when people are confronted with facts that contradict what they already believe, some of which involves their own self-image. Like, you know, I am not a person who believes in conspiracy theories or disinformation. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And to acknowledge the facts in front of you requires that. The third thing is that many of these false narratives become aligned with partisan identity.
Hmm.
So in other words, it's and in this case especially, because this was about the husband of a political opponent, right?
Right.
And so in many ways, um, believing this, it's not about the accuracy of the message, it's about signaling your loyalty
Hmm.
to your partisan tribe. And this is where the people who are focused on accuracy, people who are like, "Oh, I was wrong about that." What the followers are angry about is that they perceive that as disloyalty to the tribe.
Hmm. Hmm.
And you're right.
Yeah.
What's really key here is it's actually really important that people like that, as much as we don't like them, do that, because precisely because they do have more credibility within this bubble than someone from the outside. So Joe Biden saying, you know, no, this was a horrific attack on somebody, they're going to dismiss that. It's harder for them to dismiss it when Candace Owens or Mike Cernovich say it. They'll still get angry, but once you get a critical mass of elites who are challenge the narrative, it does give permission for people to then rethink their position.
Yeah, I follow a lot of right wing folks on Twitter, and I do it precisely. I'm not as knowledgeable about you as different disinformation, but I try to, as an amateur, kind of see what's going on in real time, so I understand the BS as it's happening in real time. And I found that fascinating here. I think that I do agree with you that Elon Musk definitely played a role. It's interesting because I also saw him, he claimed, I saw in tweets after all of this came out, that he apologized for and deleted his tweet and apologized. I've never seen the apology. I've only seen him complaining that people didn't credit or focus on his apology. I've not seen the apology, which goes to the point here, right? I mean, what people remember is him amplifying, and I think what he did, his exact tweet was something along the lines like, "Oh, there's a small possibility that there's something more to this," and that's an example of, like you said, an elite, an influencer, whatever, basically leaning into the amplifying disinformation without themselves putting themselves out there, or taking, let's say, defamation liability on themselves. People like
Exactly.
Ted Cruz did the same thing, right? Like, oh, they do this with the vaccines. I see this all the time because I follow the right wingers. Like, oh boy, another person dropped dead inexplicably. Well, yeah, somebody dropped dead inexplicably. That does happen medically. People do have heart attacks and other things, but they're signaling to their base without saying it that this may be due to the vaccine.
Yeah, they're giving their followers permission to go down the conspiracy rabbit holes and like, oh, there could be more to the story. Let me do my own research and find out what
Mhm.
other stories there could be. My colleague Jen Merchika, who's a professor at Texas A&M, has a great book. It's called "Demagogue for President: The Rhetorical Genius of Donald Trump,"
Wow.
and she goes through a lot of rhetorical devices that, I mean, she's looking specifically at Trump, but many of these other people have adopted them. One of them that's my favorite, which I learned from her, is called paralipsis. And it's basically saying something, but giving yourself enough cover that you
A
didn't
lot
really
of
say
people
it.
believe
I'm
like that thing,
saying, but
like
I'm
what
not
does like a
really
lot of
saying.
people are saying.
Well, kind of like, I'm not saying that, you know, there was a relationship here, but I mean, there's more to this. Like,
Mm,
so, like, you give yourself enough room that, plausible deniability, but you're also kind of giving the wink and the nod to what it is that you're communicating, and your followers are completely receiving it. Um, so, Donald Trump does this
yes.
a lot. I think it's worth understanding that. And then the other piece, and this is a little bit of a carryover from our previous conversation, is this idea of
Mhm.
dehumanization, which is, at some level, this is really about dehumanizing a political opponent and suggesting in some way that they are deserving or brought upon themselves the violence that that they experienced. And just as another book to throw out there for our listeners, I'm listening right now to the book How Democracies Die. One of the things
Hmm.
that they talk about in terms of big red flags that your democracy is on the decline is the dehumanization of the political opponent, in a lot of different ways. And I think we do need to understand this
That's interesting.
narrative about Paul Pelosi in those terms, and it's really, really disturbing.
Yeah, I find that so interesting to hear you explain that kind of intellectually from that perspective, because I see that in real time. Like I follow some real like right wing influencers like Jesse Kelly who will constantly talk about like war and murder of the libs sort of thing. Like basically, we're not human beings; we're the libs, and we basically are subhuman and worthy of destruction. And there's a coming war; we have to destroy them, imprison them, whatever. And it's very scary to see that, and I think that is exactly what's happening here. I don't know, it's a huge problem for our society. I have to say I don't have a lot of solutions here. You may be smarter and have better solutions than I do, but it's just very problematic for me to see when I see, actual facts come out and just completely disregarded by folks, and really not mattering one way or the other.
Yeah, and just to be clear, that dehumanization, is what motivated this attacker.
Mhm. True. Yeah,
He
he
wanted
got
to
radicalized,
destroy
yeah.
he was radicalized, and so, I think that in many ways, this whole Paul Pelosi incident is one manifestation of a larger phenomenon that I think we can understand, a lens through which we can understand things like January 6th. I mean, it's when
Mhm.
your enemy is not human, when they're completely illegitimate, then anything is justified in terms of defeating them.
It's interesting because I will say one of the other, I'd say, disinformation points on the right was that the attacker was really a lib, sort of thing, to use their language. I mean, this was really some left wing, radical. And it's interesting. That's the same thing that they did with January 6th. Like, oh, it's Antifa. There's this narrative, that on Fox News and elsewhere where it's like Antifa is coming to get you, and yet right wing violence, which is it appears to me to be more extreme. I'm not an expert on it, but it appears to there's certainly January 6th, and this are certainly touch points of right wing violence,
Kyle
are ignored.
Rittenhouse.
Yeah, Kyle Rittenhouse are not only ignored, it's sometimes celebrated. I mean, I have seen some people on the right say, and I thought this was an interesting comment I saw, like, "Hey, Kyle Rittenhouse, I'm not saying he was guilty, but why are we deifying this guy?" And I mean, it's interesting because he is very much a celebrity now in right wing circles. He's
And
making
Ashley
money.
Babbitt is a martyr.
I know. And Trump holds her up as a martyr. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. And just that's How Democracies Die by Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky. Highly recommend.
Very interesting. All right, Asha. So before we go, we were talking before we started recording about the fact that I'm half out of breath because I literally just came from a difficult workout. I'm trying to move back to working out in the mornings, which I think is the better way to do it. I am not nearly as successful when I work out later in the day.
Really? So I want to hear more. So tell me more about your whole workout thing and how you got into it and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, so for most of my life, I was very morbidly obese. Like when we were in law school, I was over 350 pounds. I was like, I think 368 was maybe my peak, something around there. I think was exactly about 368. So I lost a ton of weight with a personal trainer back in late 2012, early 2013, and it was like very intense. I would work out every single day, sometimes twice a day with him. And that was just I went from like super unfit to like super fit. Like,
And what motivated you to do that? Like, did you just wake up one day and say, "I'm gonna do"? I mean, because that's a lot of willpower
yeah,
and
no,
discipline.
it was really I had wanted to. I think one thing that people don't understand is that if you're somebody who's struggling with obesity, it's actually like you don't necessarily want to be unhealthy, but you actually don't have the knowledge or the capability to do that. It's like much more difficult than you might think.
Hmm.
And so people are like, "Oh, just don't eat, stop eating so much." It's like for me, I had that weight for my entire life, and so I could eat what a lot of people ate, maybe more than most, but I had already had like so much weight that like I'd had that my entire life. And so
Hmm.
it was actually I had some really bad trainers before that. And I would lose like 5 pounds a year. And then I lost with him, I think 110 pounds in 9 months. So
Wow.
it was intense, but he's just like, we've got to go. He inspired me, encouraged me. You
And did
know,
he help you with nutrition too?
Big time. Yeah, and I didn't understand, what people are really into now, like this sort of low carb thing. That was really what was big for me, and he explained all that to me at the time. Like I didn't understand. My prior personal trainer was telling me to carb load before workouts, which I now have to do because I have a disease that I have to do that. But I at the time, like obviously, it's counterintuitive. Like eating lots of carbs before I'm working out, I was gaining weight, not
Mm.
lo so I didn't know what I was doing, um, but so I was in that routine until I moved out to the suburbs. I was working out with him every day for years. And so losing him was hard. I've definitely gotten out of shape since I've moved out to the suburbs. So I'm with a new personal trainer now and getting back into it. Um,
That's awesome.
yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the Trump years really threw me off my game. I think I used to I was pretty active, went to the gym. I've always been a generally good eater, so I didn't, have a lot of problems. And plus, my kids when my kids were little, you just are burning a lot of calories, to be quite honest, because
Chasing
you're
him
like
around.
schlepping
Yeah.
your children around and walking up and down the stairs and doing all this kind of stuff. And so, the Trump years, was sort of this weird perfect storm of both my kids getting older, I'm not carrying them anymore and doing all the running around and stuff. I was drinking more.
Uh,
I mean, my alcohol consumption went up precipitously, I would say, and at least, like, definitely in the first couple of years to the point where I was just like, "This is not good," and I, would go just dry for periods of time because I just didn't want to feel like that was a big part of it. But then I also wasn't working out. As you know, we were doing a lot of TV and
yeah.
stuff, and that's all weird hours and going. And so all of a sudden, I realized that I had gained a lot of weight.
Mm.
And combined with the fact that I was also now in my 40s and my metabolism was slowing down. So I've, had to really focus on much more about what I eat, exercise, cutting back on alcohol, all of these things. And, I've gone on Weight Watchers a couple of times because that's helped me track my food and really be much more mindful about what I'm eating. But so I admire, I mean, and just the fact that you were able to do that and lose that much weight, which I completely get the level of discipline that that would require to do.
Yeah, it's hard for me. One thing that I haven't been able to do because I've never been normal in terms of having like just growing up and having a normal weight is I've had trouble being in between. Like I do very well with hard lines where I have like very regimented food, like I'm eating the same things every day. I'm always having, oatmeal for breakfast. I'm always having chicken and salad for dinner or whatever. Going from that to like being in between that and like just gaining a lot of weight by not eating well. And it's just partly I was raised in a culture and in a household where my family was obese and we were eating lots and lots of carb heavy foods. I'm Italian and my mom's an amazing cook who's won lots of cooking contests and stuff. And it's just that's always been hard for me. So it's a struggle.
Well, I'm impressed at that you're back in your training regimen. I'm trying to keep mine up. I've realized that I can work out at the end of the day. I have to get my writing done at the beginning of the day because otherwise,
uh,
I just don't have the energy to do it. So, we'll check back in on both of our progress.
Sounds good.